titled Animal Agriculture and Alternative Meats, Learning from Past Science Communication Failures. Our speaker today is Dr. Alison van Eenennaam, Cooperative Extension Specialist in the field of animal genomics and biotechnology in the Department of Animal Science at University of California, Davis. Her publicly funded research and outreach program focuses on the use of animal genomics and biotechnology in livestock production systems. Again, full biographies for all of our speakers and session descriptions are available on the Virtual Summit Event Center. With that, I will invite Dr. van Eenennaam up to the virtual stage to share her screen and take it away. Go ahead, Dr. van Eenennaam. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Hannah, and thank you for the invitation to present here this morning. And without further ado, we'll get going on this very interesting topic. So I really dislike presenting on Zoom because it's very difficult to read the room when you're sitting in your office. And I feel a little bit like this lady bird here who's commenting to her insect friends how excited she loves when she lands on a human and they get all happy. And all the other bugs are kind of looking at her like she's crazy because they clearly haven't had that same experience and they have a different worldview about their interactions with humans. And I feel like this as an animal scientist, sometimes speaking amongst my urban friends, when I talk about some of the innovations that we're doing in animal agriculture, because it seems like sometimes that is a controversial thing in and of itself. And I'm excited about the research we're doing, the genetic improvements and the opportunities for continuous improvement. And anyone working in animal ag in 2021 is familiar, I think, with the trade-offs that result from misinformation and fear-mongering around animal source foods. And I give you pink slime, a horrible sounding name for a process to add smaller pieces of lean meat to ground beef to produce a leaner product, which reduces food waste by utilizing as much meat from an animal as possible. You would think that would be a win-win from a food waste perspective. But the story of the rebranding of this from lean, finely textured beef to pink slime reveals just how much these labels matter and how futile it proves to be to try to counteract FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, with FED, facts, explanations, and data. And this is also not the first time that there have been ambiguities about the consumption of animal source foods and contradictory dietary recommendations. Thinking back over my lifetime, there's been the margarine versus butter debate, which turned out to be nothing more than a well-intentioned guess. And the don't eat eggs to eat eggs, they are the perfect protein. And now there's the eat one kingdom and not the other debate. And I guess for me, it's perplexing as a member of an omnivorous species that the framing is now that I have to pick a kingdom for dinner rather than a nice Cobb salad. And this type of dichotomous framing, the either or rather than the yes and, is a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a geneticist, because the demonization of a breeding method, genetically modified organisms or GMOs, has effectively blocked global farmer access to useful genetic innovations. And although I am sure that Abraham Lincoln meant well when he spoke these words, the data suggests that many do believe what they read on the internet. And it's been incredibly frustrating during my career that no amount of FED, facts, explanations, and data has been able to counteract the narrative that GMOs are unsafe, despite the consensus opinion of every major scientific society in the world. And so now we sit with only 37% of US adults who believe that it is safe to eat genetically modified foods, a full 51 percentage points below scientists posed the same question. And the disconnect around this topic is the greatest of any politicized topic, including evolution and childhood vaccinations. And as we have discovered during the pandemic, narratives that are based on emotion or fear are difficult to address using reason or logic. And it doesn't hurt to have a charismatic or famous spokesperson delivering the message, irrespective of their expertise on the topic. I give you the food babe, a computer science major, who is of the opinion that if you can't pronounce a chemical, It should not be in food. And she was able to successfully mobilize her food babe army to convince Subway sandwiches to remove a preservative from its bread, as that same chemical was also used in the manufacture of yoga mats. And so I now move into perhaps an even more controversial topic than biotechnology, or at least an increasingly controversial topic, and that is animal source foods. And perhaps the one thing that we can all agree on is that there is a looming demand resulting from an increased human population and rising incomes in the developing world. Collectively, the FAO predicts an increase of 400 million metric tons between now and 2050. And just to put that into perspective, that's about as much terrestrial meat as we currently produce. But it's what to do about this predicted increase as to where it gets interesting. One perspective is that of the wizard, and that is that this is a production challenge. And admittedly, this wizard perspective is the one that I'm most familiar with, and I called it this after the recent book by Charles Mann, The Wizard and the Prophet. My nutrition classes taught me that animal source foods supply high quality protein and bioavailable vitamin A, vitamin D3, B12, iron, iodine, zinc, calcium, folic acid, and key essential fatty acids that can be locally difficult to obtain in adequate quantities from plant source foods alone. There is a strong strand of pragmatism underlying this approach, and it presents a positive vision of human ingenuity. Perhaps a criticism would be that little attention is paid to potential negatives of overconsumption of animal products in middle to high income countries. Rather, the importance of meat and dairy to consumers in low and middle income countries is emphasized. And I guess the reason that I have this wizardly perspective is really historical. And just looking at the improvements in food production over the last century, as the human population increased from 1.6 billion in 1900 to 6 billion in 2000, it's really agricultural research that's fueled an avalanche of innovation, which resulted in this dramatic reduction of life-threatening famine during the 20th century. This has really been called one of the greatest unacknowledged triumphs of our time. And surprisingly, I'm going to let David Bowie summarize the role that animal scientists, nutritionists, geneticists, and herd health experts have played in this improvement from 1960s to the present. But as I play David Bowie, keep an eye on how these improvements have not been uniformly achieved throughout the world.
Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. It's gonna have to be a different man. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Don't tell them to grow up out of it. Changes. Turn and face the strain. Changes. Where's the shame you've left us up to her next to it? Time may change me. You can't twist time. Strange fascination. Our changes are taking the pace I'm going through. Changes.
Wow, chickens. The growth of the poultry industry has really been astounding. Were it not for the productivity and feed efficiency gains of the last century, how many more chickens and how much more feed would have been needed to produce the poultry that was produced in 2018? Poultry is now the most consumed terrestrial meat globally at about 132 million metric tonnes in 2020. They are definitely feed efficient, but as monogastrics, they more directly compete for human edible food. It's about a third of global soy is fed to chickens and other poultry, a fifth goes to pig, and 6% for aquaculture. And when we look at the projected increases over the next 10 years, terrestrial meat production is expected to expand by about 40 million metric tonnes, reaching somewhere around about 366 million metric tonnes by 2030. But what's important is that a lot of this increase is happening in the developing world. So we're expecting another 15 million metric tonnes of poultry, 10 million metric tonnes of pork, 5 million metric tonnes of beef, and 2 million metric tonnes of small ruminants. The bulk of this is going to happen in the developing regions, about 80% of the additional output, and that is going to occur in Argentina, Brazil, China, Pakistan, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Turkey. And if we look overall at livestock production by region, we can see that East and Southeast Asia has the most animal source food production with about 19.4 million metric tonnes, mostly driven by the monogastric species, the chickens and pigs. Western Europe, North America, South America, Latin America, and Caribbean and South Asia have comparable production levels, 12 to 10 million tonnes of protein, but the profiles are quite different, with beef, milk, and chicken playing a major role in Latin and North America, whereas Western Europe's production is primarily driven by dairy cattle, and in South Asia, you see a very important role being played by buffalo. And whilst it might not appear that there are many cattle in South Asia, when looking at beef production, low beef production does not equate to low cattle numbers, especially in India, the country with the most cattle and buffaloes on Earth. And it's perhaps somewhat ironic that a country that has one of the largest populations of cattle on Earth and the largest dairy nation has actually relatively low rates of animal source food consumption and one of the highest rates of childhood stunting. Cattle, of course, are extremely important in the Hindu religion. Again, livestock provide more than just hamburgers. And another thing that caught my attention when putting this presentation together is the large number of cattle in Africa, now home to about a quarter of the global cattle population. This graph shows growth of African cattle from 1961 to 2018. Many developing countries have relatively high emissions intensity for beef, in part due to low production per animal, and also because ruminants are collectively responsible for a disproportionate amount of livestock greenhouse gas emissions by virtue of the methanogens in their rumen producing methane as they digest cellulose. Putting these numbers together, we can see that the developing world is contributing about 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants and about 56% of the emissions from monogastrics. The good news is that there's a significant potential for further efficiency gains because whilst technologies and practices that reduce emissions are in existence, they're not widely adopted, despite the fact that many offer both economic as well as environmental benefits. And the FAO reports that such efficiency strategies potentially have an opportunity to result in a reduction of up to 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector. And in this increased efficiency strategic perspective, the livestock sector is identified as a really important stakeholder in delivering on the mitigation efforts necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, don't alienate the world's farmers and ranchers. They are actually going to be key stakeholders and partners in trying to address the greenhouse gas emissions. It's estimated about 81% of additional beef produced is going to be produced in Argentina, Brazil, China, Pakistan, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And looking at these emissions intensities per kilogram of protein for beef, there's some work to be done. There is ample opportunity for intensification to be steered towards low emissions livestock, especially in where the livestock sector is serving social and economic purposes in addition to providing food. That is my wizardly take on the situation, admittedly wizardly, which perhaps contrasts to the more profity take. And in this particular instance, the prophet sees this as a consumption challenge, which requires changes to the dietary drivers that determine food production and demand restraint. This perspective tends to really emphasize obesity-related chronic diseases and focuses particularly on industrial animal production or factory farming, and pretty much ignores the fact that most animal production takes place in extensive production systems in the developing world. And notably, whilst this perspective strongly emphasizes the diet-related chronic diseases associated with overconsumption in middle and high-income countries, it tends to overlook that they provide a vital means to improve malnutrition and stunting in low and middle income countries, especially in rural communities. Many with this perspective favour meat taxes and other government interventions to alter dietary habits, and is perhaps most epitomised by the Eat Lancet diet that was proposed. And recently, this has kind of morphed into what I see as this plant-based food pick a kingdom dichotomy, and it's particularly evident in the discussion around plant-based meat substitutes. So what are these plant-based meat substitutes? Well, they're just that. And they're not really your grandpa's veggie burger, though. Oftentimes, they include additives that have been produced in cellular agriculture. And these additives provide nutrients that are high in animal products like maybe B12 or soy, leg hemoglobin, synthesized by recombinant microbes. In a way, it's kind of a wizardly or technological approach to make more realistic meat substitutes based on the belief, or sometimes the conviction, that animal source foods are invariably bad. And you can see here some well-known, high-profile plant-based products that are available in the United States. Shown here are the co-founders of Perfect Day, which is basically creating vegan dairy proteins without cows. And this particular company frames their advancements as follows. Finally, a new option for dairy lovers and plant-based fans alike. We've invented the first real milk proteins made without animals, so you can enjoy the real taste, texture, and nutrition of dairy produced sustainably without the downsides of factory farming, lactose, hormones, or antibiotics. And shown here are two rather infamous plant-based beef substitute companies, Beyond Beef and Impossible. These companies were improbably, I guess to me anyway, both founded by Californian men with the last name of Brown, who have a real fondness for wearing cow t-shirts. One, Beyond Meat, is produced from peas as their main product, and it's proudly non-GMO, as you can see by the little butterfly here, which is kind of a gutsy or perhaps ill-fated move to eliminate cellular agricultural additives from the supply chain, because where are they going to get the vitamins and minerals that are make these products as nutritious as meat? And they went public in 2019. The other, Impossible, is proudly GMO and is produced from soy. In fact, the founder, Pat Brown, shown here, is a scientist who used to be a professor at Stanford and was one of the inventors of the DNA microarray, and he co-founded the Public Library of Science in 2001. He received a National Academy of Science Award in molecular biology. His origin story is in 2009, he took a sabbatical where he considered how to spend the rest of his career. And there he founded Impossible Burger. It is proudly genetically modified with its infamous bleeding GMO leg hemoglobin. And ironically, the same anti-GMO groups that have targeted genetic engineering in agriculture went after the Impossible Burger and for using GMO heme and soy. And using the same fear-mongering around GMOs in Impossible Burgers, claiming that it hurts rats in a feeding study. This is from the group GMO Watch that made a lot of hay out of the Seralini GMO rat study, and the usual players, Consumer Reports, Center for Food Safety, were criticizing the burger and casting doubt, fear, uncertainty, and doubt on the product. But Impossible Foods fought back. Here's Rachel Conrads, the Chief Communications Officer, saying, finally, we would like to request that Consumer Reports disclose its anti-GMO agenda in full transparency and the biases of its activist employees. For years, Consumer Reports and fellow anti-GMO ideologues have been waging a PR war against GMOs, whether in vaccines, insulin, cheese, or more recently, the Impossible Burger. So far, I'm loving this high-tech source of plant-based protein, adopting genetic innovations to improve its nutritional profile and to help address the upcoming tidal wave of protein demand. All hand or technologies on deck, as they say. and a willingness to defend the need to use innovation in agriculture and food production, which seem to be a pretty obvious ally. Here's Pat Brown discussing his company.
What do you see as the future of your company, like in 10 years? What do you see in Possible Foods?
Well, our mission is to completely replace animals in the food system by 2035. So, and you laugh, but we are absolutely serious about it. And I think it's doable. And I'll just say, better technology wins in the market. And, you know, from the time the first super crappy low resolution digital camera came on the market until Kodak basically shut down its film business was about 10 years.
Okay, so just to be clear, in 14 years' time, your company plans to eliminate animals from the food system globally? Because that would be, on a simple weight basis, around 15 trillion quarter pounders annually. And to put that, I put that number on a super crappy low resolution digital camera, because I really think there's a fundamental distinction between technology required to make digital cameras or DNA microarrays, for that matter, and food. And the fact that livestock serve social, religious, and economic purposes other than production in the livelihoods of more than 1 billion people. And it's just incredibly ignorant to me that this attitude ignores the importance of animals in smallholder food systems where they provide nutrition and income and asset provision, insurance and nutrient cycling. And institutions such as the FAO have been working towards higher awareness of the importance of the livestock sector to the Sustainable Development Goals. Eliminating animals from smallholder food systems would have huge ramifications on over 1 billion poor people, mostly pastoralists in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, 2/3 of whom are women and who depend on livestock for food and livelihoods. Cultured meat, in contrast, is not made of plants. It's made of animal cells grown in bioreactors. It basically seeks to replicate the growing conditions provided by biological systems, i.e. animals, to enable cell proliferation in a heated cell culture media. The discoveries required to reduce this idea to practice are going to require a number of innovations, many of which were actually ironically pioneered by animal scientists. There's going to be the need to develop immortalized cell lines, to develop media to sustain growth in the absence of serums, growth factors to promote differentiation down different cell lineages. And interestingly, in the discussion around this topic, the framing of the health effects associated with the developed world excess consumption of animal products just magically pivots to focus less on overconsumption to risks associated with foodborne illness, antibiotic use, and preventing future global zoonotic pandemics. And I give you here, Singapore approved the sale of the first cultured meat product, and that was produced by a California startup, Just. And it basically is a lab-grown chicken meat that's actually a blended product. So it's being blended with plant-based proteins, and it's being sold at the 1800 Social Club in Singapore for $23. This California-based company was developed by vegan mayo and liquid egg creator Josh Tetrick, who has been dubbed the Elon Musk of condiments. And we're going to move countries finally. We've been in California a lot, and I'm going to go over to Israel, where they built the first lab-grown meat factory. The company says that its land-based manufacturing model is going to result in 80% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than traditionally produced meat. And again, and you know how much this thrills me, they're going to really make sure this is GMO-free meat. Again, a pretty gutsy move for some of the innovations I think that's going to be required to reduce this production to practice. To go GMO out of the gate really is a pretty gutsy move. They plan to introduce hybrid products into the market that will combine plant proteins for texture and cultured fats to create aroma and flavor of meat. And whilst their existing costs are $150 per pound for chicken and $200 per pound for beef, it aims to make its hybrid products competitive at the cost level by 2021. that's this year. And this framing around the reduction in land use and greenhouse gas emissions is really where I think we're getting a lot of the venture capital interest in this area. So who's investing? And I give you this very diverse group of billionaires, some of whom you probably recognize. And I got to say, as long as I've worked in animal agriculture, the only talk I've ever given to an all-male room was venture capitalists. And I will give some credit to Bill Gates here, because he actually is also investing in trying to improve the efficiencies of animal production systems, especially on the African continent. And he's funded things like the African Dairy Genetic Gains and the African Chicken Genetic Gains Project, and the Center for Tropical Livestock Genetics and Health. You'll notice a number of traditional protein, animal protein players here, and I think they see a business opportunity to, I presume, sell a product. I would assume that plant-based products should come in at a less cost than animal-based products, and they see a market opportunity here. So let's have a look at the kind of the driving rationale behind the alternative meats. Is it often invokes kind of a simplistic narrative as it relates to a single metric, and that is greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of protein. And I have here on this graph different sources of protein and the greenhouse gas equivalents in CO2 equivalents per kilogram of protein. This framing is as if the only nutrient you get from animal source foods is protein, which clearly we know is not true. And it's not the only protein that's important, but that's often the framing. And here we see the animal source foods, his meat substitutes or Impossible Burger type products, cultured meat. And then over here we have insects and pulses, and that's basically, if you're not in the agriculture field, that's an edible seed from a legume plant, and spirulina, which is a type of algae. And if you are really interested in reducing your environmental footprint, these three sources almost invariably come in low across the board. And the functional unit here is a kilogram of protein. And what is being pushed is to try to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of protein. And you'll see this big number here for beef and sheep. And that's not surprising, because they are ruminants and therefore they produce methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And so relative to the monogastrics, this metric is always going to make ruminants appear high. But there's a lot of variation in this number. And I find it somewhat ironic that the collective work of nutritionists and geneticists and veterinarians, especially in the United States, have dramatically reduced the environmental footprint of animal source food, and such that it gets down to the lower levels here. This tends to be in more extensive systems. And we have therefore the very same goals of reducing the environmental footprint of food that's espoused by the alternative meat companies, which ironically are also being formed in the developed world. And it's, I think, a shared goal that we have. Is there anything that we can do to maybe not rip each other apart, but maybe work together towards this shared goal? I will just mention the cultured meat LCAs, or the calculations, are all kind of hypothetical or anticipatory at this stage. And there's a particularly famous one that was done by Tumesto back in 2011 that had some very, very simplifying assumptions that I think were growing animal cells in basically culture for yeast, which as someone that grows animal cells in my lab, I think is not going to be feasible. But this one often gets pulled out because it has these very favorable. And I got to give this researcher, Tumesto, she's actually gone back and done a bit of work, and she actually has kind of now realizes, I think, that there is importance to animal source foods, and it's perhaps one of the people I've seen who's had a rethink after having a look at the data. So I'm going to ask the quiz to be launched here, and I would like the audience to please respond. What percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to the livestock sector? And I think this is kind of an intriguing question, because I'll be curious to see what sort of range of numbers I get back here. Given the focus on livestock and greenhouse gas emissions, I think that this is a really important number for us to know. And so I'll let the poll runner show me the results when they feel that everyone's had a chance to respond here. Oh, we go. There we go. Okay, so you're kind of all right at some level, except the 30%. So this number, the 4%, is basically livestock's contribution to US greenhouse gas emissions. This number is global direct emissions of agriculture. This number, 10%, is contribution of all of agriculture to US gas emissions. This 14.5% number is global, but it's a life cycle assessment. It's not direct emissions. It includes also feed production. And this 18.4% is global ag, forestry and land use. And the 30% actually doesn't have a genesis. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So here is showing that energy is responsible for around about 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions globally. It really is the kind of the elephant in the room, if you will. Here's agriculture, forestry and land use at 18.4%. And here's livestock and manure at 5.8%. And like I said, this is the direct emissions that doesn't take into consideration impacts on land use change or pasture for animal feed. And it can be directly compared with the direct emissions from transport, which are tailpipe emissions. And Frank Mitloehner has famously kind of called out that this is an apples to apples comparison. And so I think there was quite a controversy when Livestock's Long Shadow came out, because it was actually comparing a life cycle assessment of livestock to a tailpipe emission of transportation. And if we look at the tailpipe emission of transportation is 8 gigatons, if you do a life cycle assessment of livestock's impact, then you get a number that's 8.1 gigatons. And this is basically looking at not only the direct emissions from enteric fermentation, as in the methane that's produced by cattle and manure management, but what you see here is you also include land use change and all of the inputs that go into producing feed. And collectively, this number is 8.1 gigatons, and that is about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So these numbers have a lot of nuance associated with them, and the ruminants shown here versus the monogastrics are responsible for around 3/4 of this because of this production of methane, shown here in red. And it's a biological function that beef and dairy cattle, small ruminants and buffalo, that is how they digest cellulose. And this framing around greenhouse gases is almost invariably what people look at when they're looking at the environmental impacts of diets. And all food production is associated with various impacts. And these particular authors looked at 93 studies of low environmental impact diet literature. And they listed here 14 variables that are important to consider when considering the environmental impact of food production. And they noticed that the greenhouse gas calculations was very highly prevalent in these studies, but that other aspects, including things like biodiversity loss, were not addressed at all. And these authors said, although it's undoubtedly an important area of concern, this one metric is not a proxy for the full range of environmental concerns associated with food production and consumption, and it may not even be the most important one. Some of the environmental areas of concern identified were rarely addressed in these literature. And they asked, as it regards sustainability, which metric are you trying to optimize? Because they don't all point in the same direction. There are trade-offs. And they basically concluded that the limited evidence generally points to recommended diets having lower environmental impacts than typical diets, although not in every case, because healthy foods like fruit and veggies often have high environmental footprints. But they noted that a lot of this can be explained by the fact that typical diets often have overconsumption of food energy associated with recommended diets. And that, of course, is a major driver of obesity. In other words, the typical diets are high in greenhouse gas emissions because they have a lot more energy than is actually needed and is recommended. And so when you're recommending diets, you basically assume everybody's going to eat that recommended amount rather than perhaps what they're typically doing. And they conclude that be careful about assuming that a dietary strategy to reduce overall environmental impact can be readily defined, let alone recommended. And one of the things I think is really playing out at the moment is this contradiction around greenhouse gas emissions between different groups of researchers, I guess. And that is that traditional LCAs, life cycle assessments, don't account for soil carbon sequestration. And so they don't take into account the full carbon story, especially for ruminant agricultural systems. On the one hand, the livestock sector is seen as part of a positive strategy to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. But on the other hand, reducing the consumption of animal products is suggested as a key strategy to reduce dietary greenhouse gas emissions. And these two perspectives can really only be reconciled if the methods used to assess the greenhouse gas emissions associated with dietary patterns become more sophisticated and take into account the local and regional differences in agriculture and the uptake of sustainable agricultural practices. And we can see here that there is actually quite a lot of potentially attainable increase of soil organic carbon on grasslands. And halting expansion into forests for feed production and pasture is certainly an urgent priority, but vast quantities of carbon are sequestered in the cropland used to produce feed and the grazing lands on which ruminant livestock are raised. This graph shows the potential attainable soil organ carbon capture that could happen on grasslands. And I think it's super important that the LCAs that have been done to date, which don't take into account carbon sequestration, are actually being updated. So this is the GLEAM 2 was the 14.5% number. GLEAM 3, which is currently under development with a base year of 2015, is actually going to have enhanced accounting of nutrient use and carbon sequestration in livestock systems. And it's going to include modules on carbon sequestration. And I think that's a really big improvement and certainly an important one because there's a lot of land occupied by ruminants and obviously therefore a lot of opportunity for potential capture of soil organic carbon. Another metric that's used quite often is the land use metric. And here, again, not surprisingly, the extensive ruminants out in non-arable land take up a lot of land. But not all land is arable, and using this metric is kind of inherently biased against pasture or rangeland production systems. There's no reason to conclude that food production on well-managed pasture and rangelands is less sustainable than food production on well-managed arable croplands, simply because the former achieves lower yields and therefore requires more land use. And I think that do you want intensive production systems with low land use and greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product, or extensive systems which maybe have the opportunity to also capture carbon? And here again, my friend Tumesto is making the argument that livestock production, especially extensive cattle grazing, maintains habitats and species and is therefore really important for biodiversity. And so eliminating all livestock is really not reasonable from the perspective of biodiversity conservation. And perhaps most importantly is that livestock are a hugely important role in sustainable ag systems as nutrient recyclers and upcyclers, and their ability to utilize plants and other food that humans cannot consume. And globally, around 86% of the feed, dry matter ingested by livestock is inedible by humans. It's grass and leaves, and very importantly, crop residues and byproducts. And as our population increases, these are going to increase in size as well. And here, I think, is a picture of me alongside a cow rumen. And to me, this rumen is this vat of microbes. It's a self-propelling, self-cleaning, solar-powered, cellulose-driven bioreactor. It really is an amazing invention. The production of global feed requires around about half of all global agricultural area, but about 2 billion of this is grassland, and about 1.3 is not able to be converted into cropland or rangeland. What this means is about 57% of the land used for feed production is not suitable for food production. And so if you just removed animals from that land, it would produce no human food. And that does not seem like a very sustainable perspective. And I've got to say, I read this Rethink X report that came out in September 2019. And here the authors are of the opinion that there's going to be basically by 2035, that's when I guess Impossible Burger is going to replace all animals in the food supply. There's going to be a disruption of the US beef and dairy industry such that 450 million acres, which is about half of US cropland or farmland, is going to quote unquote become available. Last time I checked, it was mostly privately held. But and so what I think is really interesting is that what these authors looked at was, well, what's going to happen to this land? And they basically said that because pasture land is far from cities with no prospect for productive agricultural use and very little amenity value, they came up with the brilliant proposal that maybe the best proxy for land that has no alternative productive use might be ranch land. I think that's kind of what we've been saying. I don't know what they thought of when they were talking ranch land there. I'm guessing maybe dude ranches, or they alternatively thought it could be rewilded. And so that's kind of an interesting vision for someone else's land. Anyway. That was an interesting perspective. So depending on one point of view, there's kind of a third perspective, and that is that this is a socio-economic challenge, which considers both production and consumption and sees the problem of imbalance. That is, too much animal source food in the developed world and too little in the developing world. And I guess the trouble with this balance perspective is kind of summarized in this little poem. An old statistician named Angus McPherson kept his head in the stove and his feet in the freezer. The strain was immense, but to him it made sense. On the average, he was a comfortable geezer. And I think if we look around the world, this is per capita supply of animal protein in grams per day, going from left to right. And we need around about 50 grams of protein a day at a fully grown adult. And what you see here is the Global Hunger Index. And that's actually an index that was developed that captures the multidimensional nature of hunger, considering undernourishment, child wasting, child stunting, and child mortality. And so if you have a very high GHI score, you have extremely alarming levels of hunger. And various forms of micronutrient deficiencies affect about 2 billion people globally. And these are kind of hidden hunger caused by zinc and vitamin A deficiencies, followed by iron deficiencies. And this can impair growth and immune function, and in the case of iron, impaired cognitive development. An important factor contributing to these deficiencies is the consumption of mainly plant-based diets that are low in micronutrients. And children in particular have difficulty in obtaining adequate energy and nutrients from bulky plant-based diets. And if we look perhaps in the United States, this is a breakdown of where we get our protein from in a typical diet. And like I mentioned before, you need around about 50 grams. So I think perhaps we could all agree we don't need to eat 110. What the makeup of the protein is I think a matter of personal choice. But I do think that the overconsumption in the developed world is a real issue. And so conclusions, this particular perspective is really interested in diverse systems that are seen as better able to deliver a full range of micronutrients, especially for women and children in global supply chains. And I guess if I was going to criticize this perspective, it tends to romanticize smallholder production. And many with this perspective argue for kind of organic or agroecological approaches that arbitrarily forbid the use of certain technologies or innovations without kind of acknowledging the resulting trade-off or yield gap. And that's why I call this perspective kind of the magician. And I think undermining the use of technologies and innovations puts at risk the potential future use of those technologies in all agricultural production systems. And this perspective tends to favor socioeconomic governments of the food system. And I guess I see some of this thinking, at least in my mind, in kind of the EU's Green Deal, where they're going to dramatically reduce or increase certain production methods and reduce inputs without really addressing what the impact on sustainability and productivity of the EU's farming sector might be. And finally, we get to energy. And here the picture changes a little bit. And that's not surprising because you basically need a source of energy to power the factories. These really are factories. And so depending on whether that source of energy can be decarbonized, this potentially has a big impact on the environmental footprint of these particular products. I'm not going to dwell on this one environmental metric because I really think the discussion needs to be more complex than this. And I think if we look at different aspects of food production, and we can look here at energy, blue water footprint, greenhouse gas emissions as 3 examples of metrics that are important to sustainability of food production, we can see that some healthy products like fruits and vegetables and nuts have high demands for water or electricity. And if we actually totally forgot about health and said we want to eat the lowest possible environmental impact diet, we would get pushed down to the right side of this graph. So added sugars, solid fats, and oils. So how do you like that, nutritionists? Probably not a recommended diet. And so there are these trade-offs when we're trying to balance all of these metrics that I think are really important. And we've been talking a lot about global perspectives, but I did want to just restate that in the US agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions, and it's always represented by a cow, although ironically livestock is 4% and the rest of agriculture is 6%, is about 10% here, and that the majority of emissions are coming from these manufacturing, electricity, and industrial sectors. I will notice again that the removals by forests and other lands are not part of this equation. So you're counting emissions, but you're not counting carbon capture in livestock production systems. So I think that, addressing the future protein demand is going to require the efforts on the environmental efficiency of food production. But I admit that this approach on its own is not going to deliver a sustainable food system, and that equal attention actually needs to be paid by these issues raised by other framings. But I would argue that we're probably going to need wizards and prophets and magicians and plants and animals and cell culture and farmers and especially women to be involved in developing culturally appropriate food production systems to sustainably address this projected increase. So how are we going to communicate this challenge? And do we, given the nuances and complexities that I've mentioned in the last half hour, how should this discussion be framed? How will we learn from past communication failures? Will we use kind of kindergarten level arguments to scare people away from the competition, as Food Babe did with the chemicals in your food boogeyman? Analogizing plant-based burgers to dog food? Do we really want to use the tactics of the same groups that have created fear around agricultural innovations? And I gotta say, I cringed when I saw the following ad air at the Super Bowl in January of 2020.
Your word is methylcellulose.
Can you please define that?
Methylcellulose. It's a chemical laxative that is also used in synthetic meat.
Why?
Sorry, incorrect.
Spell propylene glycol.
What's that?
Propylene glycol. It's a chemical used in antifreeze and synthetic meats.
P-O...
You might need a PhD to understand what's in synthetic meat. Fake bacon and burgers can have dozens of chemical ingredients. If you can't spell it or pronounce it, maybe you shouldn't be eating it. Go to cleanfoodfacts.com.
Bacon. B-A-C-O-N.
And don't even get me started on this one. Are we really going to use this FUD tactic, fear, uncertainty, and doubt? Then, if we're going to start suggesting that soy or Impossible Whoppers is going to give you man boobs, then I guess we shouldn't be surprised when the response is that there's no evidence soy will give you man breasts, but dairy, on the other hand, probably could. And so now we have kind of an equally ridiculous framing coming back from some of the alternative meat people. And I give you this ad featuring Patrick Brown of Impossible Foods, citing the very same group that put out disinformation around his GMO heme.
And our first word is poop.
What? Are you supposed to say that?
Poop. The stinky brown stuff that comes out of your butt. Poop is a mixture of incompletely digested food and billions of bacteria expelled from the bowels of animals. There's lots of poop in the places where pigs and cows and chickens are killed and chopped to bits to make meat. And there's poop in the ground beef we make from cows. Poop.
Poop. P-O-O-P. Poop.
Yes!
In 2015, Consumer Reports tested 300 samples of ground beef. They discovered that all of it, including grass-fed and organic ground beef, contained fecal bacteria. Just because a kid can spell poop doesn't mean you or your kids should be eating it. Go to impossiblefoods.com/health.
Is this really the best we can do around these super important and global problems? I think we just have to have a more nuanced discussion that moves away from this nonsensical plant versus animal, synthetic versus natural, extensive versus intensive, GMO versus organic, alternative versus real, good versus evil dichotomies. It is possible to improve the efficiency of production systems of animal source foods, plant source foods, and cultured meat without denigrating any. And whilst I think there are many practices that are in existence, we can actually work as a livestock sector in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, we can work on strategies to reduce the environmental impact of cultured meat and plant-based alternatives. The FAO estimates that improved management practices alone is going to be able to reduce the emissions of livestock systems, methane in particular, by 30%. What about intensifying recycling efforts? Food waste, for example, is a huge issue. 40% of food is wasted. Can we repurpose some of that food waste to be animal feed? I've mentioned the potential role of carbon sequestration on well-managed grazing lands, and I think that this is a huge opportunity for the livestock sector, and there's increased metrics getting developed around it, and how can the livestock sector contribute to this? What about, as we're doing in California, repurposing manure and slaughterhouse waste to produce biogas, producing sustainable sources of energy? What if we use that to power the alternative meat plants? Or maybe we take some of the waste from alternative meat plants and use that to feed livestock. What are we going to do with spent culture media in these cell culture meat plants? I think there's different options where we can have maybe solar panels that are used to provide shade for cattle and then also energy. I've seen that in some feedlots. Can we use biotechnologies to produce improved feedstuffs for both plants and alternative meats? I certainly see there's going to be room to use, for example, genetically modified organisms to make better feedstuffs for livestock, but also potentially better feedstuffs for the cell culture media. And there are some in this very department that I sit in, animal science, that are working to help with that goal. I don't see that we have to be competitors in this regard. And I think there's some really interesting feed additives that are being worked on too. Ermaeus Kabrab in this department, seaweed, for example, to reduce methane emissions from livestock ruminant diets. And I guess my message is that this dichotomous framing and using the tactics that basically activists have used to denigrate innovations in food production is not in the best interests of global food security. And I think that we all have to work towards having compelling stories about how innovation is working towards our shared goal of decreasing the environmental footprint of providing nutritious food, to counteract the possibility that we're going to have blocked access to innovation, and that misinformation, fear, and uncertainty is going to actually inhibit our ability to adopt safe innovations in all food producing sectors, to the ultimate detriment of global food security. So thank you for the opportunity to present here this morning, and I am looking forward to taking questions. And so I will stop sharing here and get back on the screen.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for a very thought-provoking discussion. Excellent to kick off the virtual summit. We do have lots of questions already in the queue, but if you do have a question, please use the Q&A box to enter it. You can also upvote the questions that are already there. So the current most popular question I will present to you is, why do you think it is that cattle, especially beef, has become the focus, the scape cow, if you will, for all conversations about greenhouse gas emissions, especially noting that consumption is lower in the US than previously?
Because it's the biggest contrast, right? And so you never really see a comparison to milk or dairy beef. It's always extensive beef range, and there's a big those bars show there's a lot of range there, and the reason for that is, of course, is that some beef is produced on very marginal land, and so you basically have low productivity, and it takes a long time for those animals to get to market, and so that makes their profile look the highest relative to others. If you were comparing to chicken, in some cases, actually, chicken does better than some of the anticipatory life cycle analyses around cultured meat. So you don't want to compare yourself to someone that you don't look that much better. And so invariably, the framing, even when you're producing chicken, so the cultured chicken that was produced in Singapore, they compared themselves to beef. And I'm like, you're not producing beef. You're producing chicken nuggets with filler. That's what you should actually be comparing to. And so I think it makes it look the worst. And so you'll often, I see this sneaky kind of substitution for meat, but they actually are doing beef. And so it kind of the low footprint of the monogastrics is kind of ignored to some extent, because beef makes it look like a bigger contrast, and it is a bigger footprint. Like, I think there's no denying that methanogens happen in ruminants and they don't happen in monogastrics, so that's why it's bigger. But that's their role in the biosystem, right? And so that's their magic superpower. And so yeah, you get the methane, but you get 57% of global land producing human food where it otherwise wouldn't. And that trade-off, it just has to be part of the discussion.
Great. The next question we have here, first a compliment, fantastic presentation. From a consumer perspective, why do you think food tech seems more acceptable than ag tech?
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? It's kind of one of the perplexing things of my time. Like, totally happy to inject insulin or God forbid my COVID vaccine, but don't give me a GMO in my food. And I guess there's always been that contrast there around food per se, or being something special. But then why is it accepted in food tech but not agricultural tech? And I think the framing has often kind of revolved around kind of more corporate control or some sort of a big industry boogeyman that's trying to take over the world. Whereas, Impossible Burger is seen as a savior rather than a big boogeyman that's trying to take over the world. So a different framing. Also, just speaking to some of these venture capitalists, as you do when you live in this state and you're an hour from Silicon Valley, the level of misunderstanding of how agriculture works, and then is kind of breathtaking. And so I think it's easier to conceptualize doing something to food maybe than to changing an entire ecosystem, and kind of really thinking through the ramifications of what are you really suggesting this? Because what you're saying right now is kind of ludicrous. And so, yeah, it's just, it is very eye-opening when you've got investors that really know very little about what the implications of what they're suggesting might do.
Well, and to your first point, there just seems to be a lot of distrust around anything big, whether it's the government or companies or, any kind of institution that's seen as big. It just tends to be distrusted, even though, as you shared, there's a lot of money going into these startups. It is not a grassroots kind of plucky, individual trying to change the world here. There's a lot that's behind this. So I guess how can we as animal agriculture communicate about that and kind of balance what you were saying? We need to set the record straight without denigrating and pointing fingers. So how do we walk that line of correcting the narrative and sharing factual information without being negative about competitors?
Well, so I mean, that's typical storytelling 101, right? So what do you have in common with your audience? And if it really is environmental footprint of agriculture, then there's a good story to be had, and to be told. And there are some innovations coming down the line that are really exciting. And so I think that's the framing that has to be there. I guess I find it frustrating that the metrics are set up in a way that it's almost like if you wanted to really pick on extensive ruminant agriculture, you would set up metrics that didn't allow you to count soil carbon capture, that has a very big weighting on methane in the 100-year global warming potential. And I think Frank is going to get into the kind of the alternate metrics for whether short-lived climate pollutants like methane should be weighted the same as long-lived climate pollutants like carbon dioxide. But all of those metrics, it's almost like, wow, it almost seems like they were designed to make, a really big footprint for beef production. And yes, they use a lot of land, and it's like, is that a bad thing? It's like, what's that land doing otherwise? And that kind of has to be
ranch land,
addressed.
ranch dressing land.
Ranch land. I know. I have no idea what they were thinking when they wrote that sentence, but I don't think I've ever read a more ironic statement in a think tank report. And just kind of mind blowing.
There's two questions here about animal protein and human health. So what are your thoughts on potentially undesirable effects of animal protein on human health? That's one question. And then another is on the positive side, that this attendee, their understanding is that plant protein and animal proteins are not equal, and that animal protein, it can be superior in how the human body absorbs the nutrients. So I'll let you weigh in on both of those. I know we also have several RDs on the line here, so you folks feel free to type in answers to the question.
Now I feel like I've got imposter syndrome, because it's like I am a geneticist, but I do know this from my nutrition classes, and that is that it's high quality protein, and so it has to do with the essential amino acids, and it's a good source. I think egg is actually one. It's like the perfect protein, so to speak. But I think that the framing of protein and not distinguishing between, well, is it bioavailable and also all the other nutrients, and basically, animal source foods are highly nutritious, dense, and they have a whole bunch of micronutrients that's hard to mimic with just substituting protein from a plant doesn't mean it's nutritionally equivalent. And the functional unit of kilograms of protein, or even worse, I've seen kilograms of food, as if a kilogram of lettuce is the same as a kilogram of beef. It's kind of nonsensical to really talk about food like that, because why are you eating food? Presumably for the nutrients. If you're eating it for some other reason, fine. But that's really, I think, why we're eating food. And so it's really, the functional unit probably needs to be more nuanced, because there is higher bioavailability of nutrients in animal source foods, and it's a different quality of protein. And so, and is there evidence on overconsumption of animal source foods that's detrimental. And I think that there's quite a big literature out there of kind of nutritional epidemiology that suggests that overconsumption of all foods is not good for you, particularly salt and sugar, and that overconsumption of calories is a bad thing. The literature on the badness of livestock products is a little murkier in terms of if you're eating sensible amounts. When I say sensible, I'm talking what grandma said, a little bit of everything. If you're eating moderate amounts, I think it's part of a balanced diet, I think is what the literature shows. Totally eliminating it is something that has to be done with care, because you need to supplement those nutrients that are in the animal source foods. But eating 100 grams of protein a day when you need 50, that's not a good idea. So cut down, and just eat the 50 and choose whatever, balance of that you want. But I think eliminating them is not good, and too much is not good either.
Everything in moderation.
These can both be true, right?
There's a question here, and I believe you touched on this a little bit, but is there anyone who is working on a net greenhouse gas impact percentage of agriculture or livestock in particular that takes into account the benefits of carbon capture as part of the offset of methane emissions?
Yes, there are. And I think that there's a couple of different things that are going on simultaneously. So there's efforts to try. The reason, quite frankly, that the sequestration's not in there is it's really regionally dependent, and it can also be site specific. And so it's not an easy metric to quantify, and that complicates things. But having said that, doesn't mean it's not happening. And I think that there is an effort, as I mentioned, by the FAO GLEAM group to try to get metrics around sequestration included in these life cycle assessments. The thing with these LCAs is if you tell me what you would like the outcome to be, I can alter the metrics to make it happen if I use non-standardized LCAs. And there are some groups that are using crazy LCAs that are kind of encounter, I don't know, opportunity cost of the land if livestock weren't there, that makes them look way off the planet. And there are other groups that are, counting soil sequestration and finding a negative carbon footprint for that period of time, for that particular property in that particular situation. And I think it is going to be complicated, but it's certainly acknowledged that has to be part of LCAs. And I think the important thing is to get it recognized at the global level, at the FAO level, so that everybody's comparing apples and apples, rather than at the moment, I think we have kind of oranges and watermelons, and I would even argue, maybe a pork bun. It's just they're not apples and apples comparisons.
Yeah, not even close. There's a question here. How often, if ever, do you have the opportunity to inform or educate policymakers on these topics?
Me personally, I mean, on the GMO issue, I did testify before Congress that around the safety of genetically engineered food, because basically I'm a geneticist. So I guess the only reason I'm in this area is I saw the same players that had basically denigrated genetically engineered foods starting to come after the alternative meats. And then, and so I was like working as like part of that. And then I saw the alternative meats using the same technology or the same tactics. And then I saw Animal Ag doing the same thing. And I'm like, stop it, you all stop it. So I haven't actually done anything in this particular regard as it relates to policymakers. But I know, and I think Frank will probably talk about it. I know he testified last year, I think, well, maybe the year before. I think it was before COVID, before Congress, on the kind of the greenhouse gas emissions aspect, because that's his area, is greenhouse gas emissions.
Maybe that's an action item for all of us to make sure we're taking all the great science that you're sharing and putting it forth in our communications and advocacy efforts. There's a question here kind of about investors who might be kind of a big mystery to a lot of us in animal agriculture. Is there a way for the animal agriculture community to garner similar financial support and backing for innovation that the plant and cell-based proteins have received? How can we make animal ag sexy to investors so that we can innovate and make sure we're continuously improving?
Yeah, they're an interesting bunch because they live to kind of make a short-term profit. So they're looking for kind of out there ideas that they can pivot and then either sell that company, or they're not necessarily in it for the long haul. I don't think, I hate to say that, but and so it's a matter of, do you have a sexy technology that could work? And so, I think there are some interesting possibilities around, for example, methane digesters or things like that. I think there's potentially some interests in this kind of the circular economy. So how can you better utilize waste product in livestock production systems so that we're just not filling landfill with what would otherwise be livestock edible products? And so is there ways to do that more efficiently? And I think there are some opportunities there. And I guess the thing is, you have to have something that they can make their money on, right? So it has to be an idea that works in that regard. And there's certainly plenty of money going into things like precision agriculture. Some of that's a little harder to think up novel ideas for in extensive production systems, but there's some really cool stuff getting done with basically grazing management using collars, kind of like how you electrocute your dog if it goes out of the yard with a little zappy collar. So basically, and I think this is an interesting idea, is can you use satellite technology to basically move your herd to do rotational grazing, from your truck bed, and so you don't have to maybe get out there and do fence. You can set up a virtual paddock, and you can do rotational grazing every 10 minutes or whatever. Those types of things. Those are the types of things that have a potential payback that I think are that's the type of thing that they're interested in.
Excellent. I think we have time for about 2 more questions here. So second to last one, can you give a few examples of how you would suggest the animal ag community work with companies who are producing plant-based or cultured meats to solve the environmental issue, considering several of those companies are using marketing strategies that do demonize animal ag? And as you mentioned, we're not innocent either. We've done the same things. So I'll editorialize the question a little bit to add that. How specifically would you recommend going about working together, considering maybe there's been some negativity on both sides?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I guess, unfortunately, fear-mongering pays. So it actually has been a very effective strategy for the natural foods industry to demonize GMOs. And I think I saw a stock valuation for Impossible Burger at 10 billion. I mean, so maybe you should ask Patrick Brown instead of me, because clearly he's been able to monetize the fear in a way that I think, science is trying hard not to do. I guess I'd call out the hypocrisy. It's just the ignorance of a statement that just ignores the livelihood of 1 billion people is, even for a Berkeley boy, is pretty stunning. And so I think that I actually have been impressed with some of the cell cultured meat CEOs are a lot more open to just trying to address different problems. I mean, certainly they're going to need, I think, as I mentioned, the help of animal scientists to get cell lines that can differentiate immortally and stuff like that. And I think there's a little bit more open-mindedness there. It's a little bit less of a kind of a vegan kind of dogma. It's more just trying to produce a product. And I guess, is there some intriguing? There's going to be a lot of waste produced in the cultured meat concept. So you're going to have this spent cell culture media that's basically human edible products that you're going to need to dispose of. And I mean, the logical thing to me would be a pig, right? It's like, it's good for monogastrics because it's human edible, so it could be easily digested by a pig. So can you set up a cell culture facility that's producing pig cells and then actually rotate it through a pig for the water and use electricity to heat use the pig slurry to basically power the electricity for the cell culture production facility? And those are the types of kind of, I don't know, mind-bending possibilities that I think, why not? You could do that, and if the slurry can produce bioenergy, then that actually solves an issue with some of the intensive pig production facilities and that waste. And so something like that is kind of intriguing.
Well, there are companies that are already offering both. They have their traditional meat products, and then they're investing or they're spinning off product lines. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Then you can maybe say, look, we're producing pork, traditional pork, with a lower environmental footprint, or whatever. You can get on that concept as well. So I guess my point is that I think innovations are important to all of the different industries, and that by basically demonizing innovation, we really threaten the future of all food production, and that it's not helpful. And I look back at RBST, for example, as a technology that's now no longer available, basically. So it got fearmongered off the market. Well, the cows are still, producing that. So that technology is gone, but the environmental benefit of that technology is also gone. And that trade-off was never part of the discussion. And I think that's what's important to kind of bring up.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that takes us right about out of time. Really appreciate Dr. Alison van Eenennaam taking the time to visit with us this afternoon. I've put her information back up on the screen. As you probably know, she is very active on social media. So I'm sure if you sent her a tweet at BioBeef, she would get back to you